What up, YouTube? It's Knowledge of Self-Determination. Here with more Black history every day. So today I will be reading to you guys some of the life and accomplishments and achievements of Frederick Douglass. Everyone should be familiar with the name. However, there may be certain details about his life that most people are not familiar with. And again, to give a disclaimer on the reason why this is important and why I decided to do this is because our history, if we do not retain it, store it in the minds of the children that are coming up, and also as adults, store it in our own minds, our history will be forever forgotten. We already have states like Texas, for instance, that are writing history books that are literally taking black people out of the history books. They're whitewashing the history because I don't want to get too much into that. However, they are whitewashing the history. They are rewriting history and taking away all the accomplishments and achievements of our people. You know why it's so easy for them to do that? Because we don't fight to have our history taught every day. We're not fighting hard enough for that. We're not fighting hard enough for that. The legacy and the memory of Carter G. Woodson should not die so easily. He fought for us to get a week of recognition. And then in the 70s, I believe, then we got a month. Now, in the 21st century, we need to be fighting for black history being incorporated into American history. Not the little bullshit little 3 or 2 sentences that they may give on our leaders. But we need as much exposition on the lives of our people as they give on the lives of their people, like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and Abraham Lincoln and so on and so forth. Because American history is awash with all these tributes to the white founding fathers and all the white people that have come after them. But history isn't awash with all of the black people who have contributed to this country and done great and amazing things for this country. Honestly, do you people really believe that slavery would have ended just because white people wanted it to? If black people didn't fight and stand up, if there wasn't for people like Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, the list goes on and on. I don't want to exclude anybody, but there's so many people, and all of those individuals born during slavery, born during Reconstruction, born in the early part of the 20th century, or I can't include the 20th century because that was after slavery. But and even after, because we still had 100 years of Jim Crow after the 13th Amendment. All of those people, do you honestly think that America would have first allowed the 13th Amendment to even be drafted if it wasn't for black people fighting and getting on white people's nerves and having revolts and constantly standing up for themselves? Do you think they would have freed us? It took them 200 plus years to get to that point. And then another 100 years after the 13th Amendment before they saw how wrong Jim Crow was. Just think about that for a second. But I'm going to go ahead and give you guys some information on Frederick Douglass's life and read some of his life to you guys. Frederick Douglass, born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, February 1818 through February 20th, 1895. Was an African-American social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman. After escaping from slavery in Maryland, he became a national leader of the abolitionist movement in Massachusetts and New York, gaining note for his dazzling oratory and incisive anti-slavery writings. In his time, he was described by abolitionists as a living counterexample to slaveholders' arguments that slaves lacked the intellectual capacity to function as independent American citizens. Northerners at the time found it hard to believe that such a great orator had once been a slave. Douglass wrote several autobiographies. He described his experiences as a slave in his 1845 autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which became a bestseller and was influential in promoting the cause of abolition, as was his second book, My Bondage and My Freedom, 1855. Look for those books, people. After the Civil War, Douglass remained an active campaigner against slavery and wrote his last autobiography, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, published first in 1881 and revised in 1892, 3 years before his death. It covered events during and after the Civil War, which was not fought over slaves, mind you. That's just me adding that in. It wasn't fought for slaves. It was fought to maintain the Union and bring the South back into the fold, so to speak. Had nothing to do with slavery. Douglass also actively supported women's suffrage and held several public offices. Without his approval, Douglass became the first African American nominated for Vice President of the United States, as the running mate and Vice Presidential nominee of Victoria Woodhull on the Equal Rights Party ticket. So I'll go ahead and skip ahead and now read you some of the life of Frederick Douglass as it pertains to his enslavement. Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born into slavery on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay in Talbot County, Maryland. The plantation was between Hillsborough and Cordova. His birthplace was likely his grandmother's shack east of Taper's Corner and west of Tuckahoe Creek. The exact date of his birth is unknown, and he later chose to celebrate his birthday on February 14th. In his first autobiography, Douglass stated, quote, "I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it," end quote. Douglass was of mixed race, which likely included Native American on his mother's side as well as African and European. He was given his name by his mother, Harriet Bailey. After escaping to the North years later, he took the surname Douglass, having already dropped his two middle names. He wrote of his earlier times with his mother. The opinion was whispered that my master was my father, but of the correctness of this opinion, I know nothing. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant. It was common custom in the part of Maryland from which I ran away, to part children from their mothers at a very early age. I do not recollect ever seeing my mother by the light of day. She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I awake, she was gone. After this early separation from my mother, or rather, after this early separation from his mother, Frederick Douglass lived with his maternal grandmother, Betty Bailey. At the age of 7, he was separated from his grandmother and moved to the White House plantation, where Aaron Anthony worked as overseer. Douglass's mother died when he was about 10. After Anthony died, Douglass was given to Lucretia Auld, wife of Thomas Auld, who sent him to serve Thomas's brother, Hugh Auld, in Baltimore. When Douglass was about 12, Hugh Auld's wife Sophia started teaching him the alphabet. Douglass described her as kind and tender-hearted woman, who treated him as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. Hugh Auld disapproved of the tuition, feeling that literacy would encourage slaves to desire freedom. Douglass later referred to this as, quote, as the, quote, first decidedly anti-slavery lecture, end quote, he had ever heard. Under her husband's influence, Sophia came to believe that education and slavery were incompatible, and one day snatched the newspaper away from Douglass. In his autobiography, Douglass related how he learned to read from the white children in the neighborhood and by observing the writings of the men with whom he worked. Douglass continued secretly to teach himself how to read. He later often said, quote, "My knowledge is the pathway from slavery to freedom," end quote. As Douglass began to read newspapers, pamphlets, political materials, and books of every description, this new realm of thought led him to question and condemn the institution of slavery. In later years, Douglass credited the Columbian Orator, an anthology that he discovered at about age 12, with clarifying and defining his views on freedom and human rights. The book, first published in 1797, was a classroom reader containing essays, speeches, and dialogues to assist students in learning, reading, and grammar. When Douglass was hired out to William Freeland, he taught other slaves on the plantation to read the New Testament at a weekly Sunday school. As word spread, the interest among slaves in learning to read was so great that in any week, more than 40 slaves would attend lessons. For about 6 months, their study went relatively unnoticed. While Freeland remained complacent about their activities, other plantation owners became incensed about their slaves being educated. One Sunday, they burst in on the gathering, armed with clubs and stones to disperse the congregation permanently. In 1833, Thomas Old took Douglass back from Hugh as a means of punishing Hugh. Douglass later wrote, Thomas Old sent Douglass to work for Howard Covey, a poor farmer who had a reputation as a slave breaker. He whipped Douglass regularly. He nearly broke him psychologically. The 16-year-old Douglass finally rebelled against the beatings, however, and fought back. After Douglass won a physical confrontation, Covey never tried to beat him again. That's what the fuck I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about right there. This is what you have to do in order to break yourself free of bondage. Because, and again, this is not me trying to incite violence against anybody, but nobody respects a complacent people. People don't respect you when you're complacent and you roll over. Like the black people today who are sucking up to Donald Trump. These people don't respect you for that. They use you as a way to manipulate your own people, but they don't have any respect for you. They don't. That is what I'm noticing, the one thing with white supremacists and white supremacist races. The only thing they respect is you being willing to smack them upside the head. That's the only thing they respect. They don't respect cordiality. They don't respect you talking to them with a peaceful manner or trying to dialogue with them. They don't respect that from us. Look, this is why things have not changed for us in this country in all this time. This is why we still have police officers who can kill you and get acquitted or have their sentences vacated. This is why we can have these things happen. This is why we can have media that highlights every wrong thing that a black person does, but keep every shitty thing that a white person does under wraps. This is why. If you don't fight for what you believe in, nobody else is going to do that for you either. We do not live in a world where people are going to give up their white privilege in order to placate you and give you black privilege. We don't live in that world. If you want something, you take that shit. These people wanted their freedom and they took that shit. You understand what I'm saying? They took it. People like Frederick Dougalss, people like Nat Turner, people like Denmark Vesey, even though his revolution didn't get off the ground, they took it. They took it by any means necessary. And that's what we have to learn how to do today in the 21st century. Right? Now I'm going to read some sections from another website and other articles. Frederick Douglass was a prominent African-American, because they just say African-American abolitionist. Let's never forget that this man is of African descent. Let's never forget that. African-American abolitionist, author, and orator. Born a slave, Douglass escaped at age 20 and went on to become a world-renowned anti-slavery activist. His three autobiographies are considered important works of the slave narrative tradition, as well as classics of American autobiography. Douglass' work as a reformer ranged from his abolitionist activities in the early 1840s to his attack on Jim Crow and lynching in the 1890s. For 16 years, he edited an influential black newspaper and achieved international fame as an inspiring and persuasive speaker and writer. In thousands of speeches and editorials, he levied a powerful indictment against slavery and racism, provided an indomitable voice of hope for his people, embraced anti-slavery politics, and preached his own brand of American ideals. An abolitionist, writer, and orator, Frederick Douglass was the most important black American leader of the 19th century. Let's see. Upon his escape from slavery at age 20, he had adopted the name of the hero of Sir Walter Scott's The Lady of the Lake. Douglass immortalized his years as a slave in narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, 1845. This and two subsequent autobiographies, My Bondage, My Freedom, and The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, which I already read for you guys earlier. His autobiography was published. Douglass went on a 2-year speaking tour of Great Britain and Ireland in order to avoid capture or recapture by his former owner, whose name and location Douglass had mentioned in the narrative. Douglass's life as a reformer ranged from his abolitionist activities in the early 1840s to his attacks on Jim Crow and lynching in the 1890s. Let's see. Rhetorically, Douglass was a master of irony, as illustrated by his famous 4th of July speech in 1852. Quote, "This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn," end quote, he declared. Then he accused his unsuspecting audience in Rochester, New York, of mockery for inviting him to speak and quoted Psalm 137, where the children of Israel are forced to sit down, quote, "by the rivers of Babylon," end quote. There to, quote, "sing the Lord's song in a strange land," end quote. For the ways the race have caused the deepest contradictions in American history. Few better sources of insight exist than Douglass's speech, or speeches. Moreover, for understanding prejudice, there are few better starting points than his timeless definition of racism as a quote-unquote diseased imagination. Now I'll go over to a different site or a different article and read a little bit more, because everybody, highlights certain aspects of his life, in their own way. Let's see. Always striving to educate himself, Douglass continued his reading. He joined various organizations in New Bedford, including a black church. He attended abolitionist meetings. He subscribed to William Lloyd Garrison's weekly journal and The Liberator. In 1841, he saw Garrison speak at the Bristol Anti-Slavery Society's annual meeting. Douglass was inspired by the speaker, later stating, quote, "No face and form ever impressed me with such sentiments, the hatred of slavery, as did those of William Lloyd Garrison," end quote. Garrison, too, was impressed with Douglass, mentioning him in The Liberator. Several days later, Douglass gave his speech at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society's annual convention in Nantucket. The speech described at the top of this page. Of the speech, one correspondent reported, quote, "Flinty hearts were pierced and cold ones melted by his eloquence," end quote. Before leaving the island, Douglass was asked to become a lecturer for the society for 3 years. It was the launch of a career that would continue throughout Douglass's long life. Despite apprehensions that the information might endanger his freedom, Douglass published his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Dougalss, an American Slave, written by himself. The year was 1845. 3 years later, after a speaking tour of England, Ireland, and Scotland, Douglass published the first issue of the North Star, a 4-page weekly out of Rochester, New York. Ever since he first met Garrison in 1841, the white abolitionist leader had been Douglass's mentor. But the views of Garrison and Douglass ultimately diverged. Garrison represented the radical end of the abolitionist spectrum. He denounced churches, political parties, even voting. He believed in the breakup of the Union, or dissolution. However, he also believed that the U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery document. After his tour of Europe and the establishment of his paper, Douglass's views began to change. He was becoming more of an independent thinker, more pragmatic. In 1851, Douglass announced at a meeting in Syracuse, New York, that he did not assume the Constitution was a pro-slavery document and that it could even, quote, be wielded in behalf of emancipation, end quote. Okay. I've given you guys a lot on Frederick Douglass's life. And I still don't feel like I've given you enough. But I'm gonna read a little bit more because I don't want to make this but so long. But I'm gonna read a little bit more. From Slavery to Freedom. Let's see. Douglass first tried to escape from Freeland, who had hired him out as his owner, Colonel Lloyd, but was unsuccessful. In 1836, he tried to escape from his new master, Covey, but failed again. In 1837, Douglass met and fell in love with Anna Murray, a free black woman in Baltimore about 5 years older than he. Her free status strengthened his belief in the possibility of gaining his own freedom. On September 3rd, 1838, Douglass successfully escaped by boarding a train from the newly merged Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad (PW&B) railroad line to the great northern cities. The area where he boarded was a short distance east of the previous temporary PWMB train depot in a recently developed neighborhood between the modern neighborhoods of Harbor East and the Patapsco River. The depot was replaced by the historic President Street Station, constructed 1849 and 1850. It was noted as a site of other slave escapes along one of many routes of the famous Underground Railroad during the Civil War. Young Dougalss reached Havre de Grace, Maryland in Harford County, I know it well, in the northeast corner of the state along the southwest shore of the Susquehanna River, which flowed into the Chesapeake Bay. Though this placed him some 20 miles from the free state of Pennsylvania, it was easier to travel through Delaware, another slave state. Dressed in a soldier's uniform provided to him by Mary will also give him part of her savings to cover his travel costs. He carried identification papers that he had obtained from a free black seaman. Dougalss crossed the wide Susquehanna River by the railroad's steam ferry at Havre de Grace to Perryville on the opposite shore in Cecil County. Familiar with that as well. Then continued by train across the state line to Wilmington, Delaware, a large port at the head of the Delaware Bay. From there, because the rail line was not yet completed, he went by steamboat along the Delaware River further northeast to the Quaker city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in an anti-slavery stronghold, and continued to the safe house of noted abolitionist David Ruggles in New York City. His entire journey to freedom took less than 24 hours. Frederick Dougalss later wrote to his arrival in New York City, and then I'll stop. I have often been asked how I felt when I first found myself on free soil, and my readers may share the same curiosity. There is scarcely anything in my experience about which I could not give a more satisfactory answer. A new world had opened upon me. If life is more than breath and the quick round of blood, I lived more in one day than in a year of my slave life. It was a time of joyous excitement which words can but tamely describe. In a letter written to a friend soon after reaching New York, I said, quote, I felt as one might feel upon escaping from a den of hungry lions, end quote. Anguish and grief, like darkness and rain, may be depicted, but gladness and joy, like the rainbow, defy the skill of pen or pencil. Once Dougalss had arrived, he sent for Mary to follow him north to New York. She brought with her the necessary basics for them to set up a home. They were married on September 15, 1838, by a black Presbyterian minister, just 11 days after Douglass's arrival in New York. At first, they adopted Johnson as their married name to divert attention. So that's all I'm going to read because I don't want it to be but so long. And maybe in the future I'll do more on the life of Frederick Dougalss. But the man has had a very long and full life. There's tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of work on him. And I will do my best to pay my homage and respect to all my ancestors that came before me in telling their stories, because these are things that we need to know. How many people out there can actually say that, aside from people who actually study history, knew these details about Frederick Douglass's life? Not many. But in any event, I'm going to go ahead and end this video. Or rather, in this portion of this video, I should say, because up next is, in fact, you know what? I will do a separate video. This will be the first video, and the next video will be on musician Mary Lucinda Chadwell Dawson. So I'll get my information on her, and then I'll make another video. But this is not a self-termination. Like, learn, and subscribe. I'm out. Peace.